happened during the late 1970s when laws in America were so much different than they are now. And most things in a small country town were even worse. My aunt never had very good luck. And when she did, it always just seemed to lead to worse luck later on. This is her story, and the story of the person everyone wishes she had never met. When she was in her 20s, she worked as a bartender and only seemed to work the night shift. People liked her, and she was friendly. But this was long before the days where a person could stop serving you alcohol if you were way beyond the limit, which is the first part of the spiral. One night she was working late, and the guy had so much to drink that my aunt told her boss she was refusing him service because he was so very clearly not all right. The boss told her she had to serve him, so she quit, grabbed her stuff, changed her clothes, and left the bar. Unbeknownst to anyone, the drunk guy got it into his head that my aunt was his ex and wanted to make her pay for leaving him. So when she left to talk to her boss, he went to his truck, started it up, and waited for her to leave the bar. When he saw her exit, he floored it and collided with her so hard and fast that a police officer that happened to be driving by right then, but had passed them, thought the guy had swerved to hit a phone pole from the awful sound it made. The guy lived, and my aunt was pronounced dead at the scene, body so mangled that her brain was actually showing through her skull. When questioned about it later, the guy said he saw several of my aunt all crossing the street at once, and just aimed for the middle one. On the way to the morgue, she came to and freaked everyone out. 1970s American medicine was not what it is today, which is the only way I could see why they thought she was dead for so long. She kept the toe tag on her keychain as a good luck charm. She was rushed into surgery and was in a complete body cast for a very long time. There was a lawsuit involving both the bar for serving the guy so long and the guy who had hit her. She ended up winning and getting ownership of the bar, but selling it immediately. This was all done on her behalf while she was in hospital, or I think it might have gone differently. After the incident, she was deaf in one ear and had to wear a hearing aid in another, which hurt her self-esteem. She also developed some form of kleptomania. She never stole anything of value, mostly just jeans and umbrellas. My family didn't question any of it, and she never went to see anyone about it because that sort of thing was pretty stigmatized back then. She just lived with this relative or that, who would apologize for her and give things back. She would apologize over and over about it, saying she didn't know why she did those things and that she really couldn't help it. My family has never been a nice group of people, so when the opportunity came to shove her off on someone as a wife, they went whole hog. They decided that since she had so many problems now that they should put an ad out in the paper under the dating section and let it slip that she was far from poor. Yeah, real classy people. As you can imagine, someone came out of the woodwork immediately and swept her off her feet. Damn, nothing ever seemed to bother this guy. All smiles and cheer. Proposed very quickly too. Everyone in retrospect says the guy gave off sleazy used car salesman vibes. But they just didn't want to deal with my aunt anymore, so they pushed her hard to marry Dan. And she accepted. My guess is she felt like a huge burden, and having someone who seemed to like her was a huge confidence booster. Immediately after, my aunt and Dan disappeared off the map. No one saw or heard from either of them for weeks, then months. At first they were happy to not have the burden, but now concern was growing since everyone realized that literally no one had seen her in over a year at this point. Not even once. Suddenly, even my family started to feel guilty and kept trying to reach out to her when they heard that Dan had been seen around town. They wanted to talk to my aunt, but Dan was always there with excuses, or no one would answer at all when they called and went to the door. We lived in a pretty small area, and word got around fast when Dan started being seen on dates with this other woman, Betty. This was made weirder by the fact that still no one could get in contact with my aunt. They tried the police. No luck there, as not seeing someone for a long time was not considered illegal, and you couldn't file a report on that when the husband says everything was fine, because tiny country town in the 70s, I guess. So one day, everyone is surprised when a letter comes in the mail from my aunt, begging for help, saying Dan is milking her for all her money and will not let her leave the house, and took the phone away. No one knows how she got the letter out, but they rushed right over. When they got there, the cops were there already, taking her body away. They said it was suicide, note and everything. My family did not buy it. They demanded to have an investigation, a coroner's report, everything. Since she was dead, Dan got the rest of the money, no questions asked. Moved Betty in the same day they took my aunt away. Everything about this was shady. My family pulled all their limited resources together for a lawyer. They needed to get my aunt some sort of justice because they knew this was all their fault, and they felt guilty. Before they were able to get anything, she was cremated at Dan's request. Turns out some palms got greased, and all the paperwork for this to be an investigation got misplaced. The most damning part of the whole thing was that until the day she died, my aunt had a terrible phobia of fire. There was no way she would have wanted to be cremated. After that, Dan and Betty and all the money disappeared. A few years later, in the early 1980s, Betty moved back to town, told everyone she could how crazy and scary Dan was, and that he would never let her leave. Apparently, she finally passed a note to a guy at a truck stop one day, and when the cops showed up, Dan drove off without her. This all happened almost a decade before I was born. Everything I have is just lots of people in my family telling me the same story. Nothing concrete. After that, they were more open about seeking mental health and caring about one another. But they are still awful people, for lots of other reasons. 2. From 2006 to 2008, I was a student at university in England, studying paramedic science. This course was a 2-year fast track into becoming a qualified paramedic, EMT. The course involved placements at various points throughout both years. First, we spent an evening, night, in a dispatcher's. I'll never forget some of those calls. Example, a man waking up in bed next to his wife, who had died during the night. Next, we were stationed with the patient transport service, taking patients to their hospital appointments when they couldn't get there alone. Finally, after waiting a good 6 months for the opportunity, it was time to spend a prolonged placement with the 999 crews. You could choose a couple of preferred locations, and I was fortunate enough to be given the ambulance station close to my home. So I moved back to my parents' home that winter for a full term, leaving my university buddies behind. In hindsight, I wish that I hadn't, because it turned out to give me far less interesting experience. The station was in Buxton, Derbyshire. Google Map it, it's middle of nowhere territory. It's also 45 minutes from the nearest hospital, so you better not get badly hurt up there. Only, people did. One evening we were responding to a call where a guy has come off his bike on the Cat and Fiddle Run. It's named after a pub by the same name on that road, which passes over the Pennies Mountains. Bikers love to bomb it up and down, it's notorious. The guy broke a brick wall with his body. Legs were over his shoulders. We took him with the blue lights to the aforementioned hospital. I don't think he survived. This is where things got messed up. We turn out of her hospital, travel maybe half a mile, and get flagged down by a pedestrian. She shouts through the window that somebody has been beaten badly. We later find out that this was the case of somebody bumping into somebody else in a bar. Nothing more. At that exact moment, a guy in a red t-shirt stumbles out from a side street and collapses in the road. I had been in the rear passenger seat of the patient compartment, my mentor and her technician riding up front. They get out before me to help him, whilst I open the side bay. Stupidly, I climb out as my mentor helps him in. That's the point at which I notice two things. He isn't wearing a red shirt, he's topless, and saturated head to waist in his own blood. And there's a mob of people heading straight at us. Maybe 10, maybe 15, I forget. I'm still outside the ambulance and pretty much frozen in terror. I'm only 19 at this point and a pussy. This was 2007. Thankfully, my mentor hauls me inside and locks the door instantly. She then turns to me, asks if the rear door is locked. It is not. They open it from the outside. My mentor pushes them back and, I couldn't believe it, heckles them, telling them to pick on a group of people, not just one man. She then manages to lock the door. What happens next will stick with me forever. And clearly has, as I'm telling this story nearly 10 years on. They begin to try and flip the ambulance. Meanwhile, another guy starts hammering the side window, shatters it, cuts himself wide open with blood everywhere, but keeps going. They were animals. There is a window between the rear and front cabin. We see a police car approaching. He doesn't stop and continues straight past. Please give UK cops guns. I do not blame him for not stopping. Only later did I find out that the keys were still in the ignition, but nobody had attempted to enter the cabin through sheer luck. Anyway, crazy, bloodthirsty hooligan mob, let's not meet again. P.S. After this, I finished my course and went off and became an English teacher instead. The number of dead bodies I saw in the time was enough to haunt me for life. To all of you brave service folk, I commend you. 3. I live in a very small town of about 100 people in rural New South Wales, Australia. This happened when my friends and I were 14. My town used to be a very close-knit farming community, but the shift to modern times and the massive drought of the 2000s led to most of the businesses to be closed and farmers to move away. The aging population slowly died and their houses were filled with despicable types. Drug dealers and addicts, thieves and dole bludgers. It's sad, really, but even now there are still great people here. What I've always found creepy is, even though a very small population, and I've known just about everybody since before I can remember, there have always been people in the surrounding area that no one seems to know. Old loners mostly, who keep to themselves and no one ever sees them. On top of that, there have been several pedophile charges laid against some of them, and there have been numerous break-ins and attempted break-ins on our homes. Not to mention that for long stretches of time, we've been without a police officer, which means a 000 call would take an hour for help to arrive. It gets even creepier the further out bush you go. I've heard of abandoned farmsteads where families have just disappeared, with all their belongings, including cars, left behind. There was even a multi-generational inbred family, reminiscent of the Hills Have Eyes discovered a few years ago, though that's a few hundred miles from me. Anyway, I grew up and went to primary school here, but we had to travel an hour to go to high school. It took quite a while for my closest childhood friend Tim and I to make new friends. After 2 years of high school, we invited 3 friends to come to our town to go camping. Tim's parents owned a small property where they kept sheepdogs and horses a few miles from the town. We camped for 5 days there in the school holidays. The first night, as what often happens, we sat around the campfire telling stories. I told the story of some of those creepy loners I mentioned earlier, a pair of brothers that lived a few miles up the road from where we were camping. They were very rarely seen, with a reputation of being creepy hillbilly hicks. I told them the story of how one night they had tried to cripple my father over him supposedly stealing their business. They ambushed him at a local weighbridge at night. My father managed to fight both of them off. My cousin had also run into them by taking a shortcut across their field, only to hear gunfire in his direction. My cousin had lied to me before, so I didn't think it was true, but I made out like it was and later embellished their reputation with the normal inbred cannibal type crap city folk expect. On the second night, we decided to go for a walk. We were kids and enjoyed fantasy movies and games, and had a bit of role-playing fun. One of us, though, was too scared to go out in the dark, so on our walk we decided to play a prank on him. We started screaming and running back to the camp, scattered, saying, "We got Henry!" It worked, and we caused our friend Zeb to try and climb an electric fence to escape. I, Henry, came back dirty and bloody, and we hid in the farmhouse until Tim ruined the prank by claiming he heard the brothers skinned people, which caused us to burst out laughing. The next afternoon, we hiked up the nearest hill, called Sims Gap Hill. It was a popular walk for Tim and I when we were kids. The fastest way to get to the hill was by taking the dirt road called the Stock Route, which ran parallel to the main tar road, which led to the town. The two roads are connected by another sawmill road, which was at the base of the hill. Anyway, we walked down the Stock Route, and I pointed out the Hillbilly Brothers property as we went past it. All you can see from the road are piles of rusted old cars. We reached Sawmill Road and walked across the paddock to the hill and had an enjoyable time. We started climbing down the hill as it got late, but underestimated the time it took to walk across the paddock to the road. By the time we reached the road, it was night, and of course, it happened to be pitch black. As we started walking down Sawmill Road to the Stock Route, a pair of massive bright headlights turned into the road from behind us. Naturally, we got off the road, which meant disappearing into the thick patch of trees between the road and the brothers' property. As the lights caught up to us, the vehicle started slowing. Until then, we had thought it was a farmer's ute. But now, we realized it was a very old, very loud tractor. Not wanting to be questioned by any meddling adult, I encouraged the guys to hide. The tractor slowed right down and flashed a spotlight into the trees, and then sped away. The guys asked me who it was, and I said I didn't know. We continued walking slowly until we saw the tractor turn down the stock route and then into the brothers' property. Now I was unnerved. The tractor came roaring down the fence line, and I yelled at the guys to run. We ran until we came to a small, well-hidden ditch, which we jumped in and lay very still. The tractor stopped right on us and shined the spotlight over the trees. It didn't illuminate the ditch. Luckily, the driver stopped the tractor and got off, walking over to the fence. I peered up and saw the silhouette of a dirty, disheveled man with messy hair standing at the fence line, looking around. In his hands was a rifle. In a nasally Aussie hillbilly voice, he yelled out, "Where are you cunts?" We didn't dare move. I started thinking what we'd have to do if he climbed the fence, and started coming our way, but he eventually turned around and got back on his tractor. It started with a groan, and it rumbled down the other way. I got my friends up, and we sprinted towards the stock route, ducking under branches and jumping over fallen trees. We hadn't quite reached it when the headlights were behind us again, roaring up Sawmill Road. We made it to the road and panicked. It was still 2 or 3 miles back to the camp, and we wouldn't be able to outrun the tractor. On the other side of the stock route was a state forest with tens of miles of twisting dirt roads, and motorbike trails and goat tracks. Despite how dark it was, and the strong possibility of getting lost, we dove in there. We hid as he went past us again, finding a forest road which led back to the general direction of the town. We followed it for a while, wondering if he had given up, and if it was safe to go back to the stock route. Then he was in front of us, blinding headlights roaring down the forest road. We jumped back in the trees and decided to run. We ran straight past him. Behind us, he turned back on the stock route and chased us again. He circled us 4 times, with us hiding, then running, hiding, then running. When we had gone far enough that we thought we were close enough to the camp, we ran through the woods and jumped back on the stock route to be met by headlights. Tim's mother had come looking for us after finding our camp empty. She had finally found us, and we were still a mile or so from the camp. We quickly piled in and she drove us back. We told her what happened, but she and my parents just said they're weird people and to stay away from them in future.